On our last episode of Goblins Ranting into the Void, we took a look at the main theme of Arcane, legacy, and the influence emerging technology has on it. The challenges and expectations posed by new technology aren't exclusive to Runeterra. With the release of Season 2, we're asked to explore how emerging technology doesn't just affect us right now, but how it'll go on to impact the world of tomorrow. So welcome back everybody. If you haven't seen that first video yet, you should definitely check that out before this one. Today, we're shifting gears. It's not a focus on how we got here anymore, but instead a hard look at where we are now and where we're going. Just like last time though, that technological triangle still applies here. Hextech is just a fantasy version of artificial intelligence, while Chemtech stands as a parallel to modern medicine, with old world technology being left behind in favor of these advancements. Obligatory spoiler alert time, consider yourself warned, and let's get into it already. Season 2 has a lot to say and not a lot of time to say it in. It wants to talk about legacy, emerging technology, and where we're going or how we could fix it all. Where this series might have benefited from another few seasons, it instead was entrusted with telling a very serious story with very wide character arcs in a very limited space. I think Fortiche did a great job considering those constraints, but the drawback is that the narrative does feel a little bit rushed. One moment we're looking at the controlled creation of that general purpose technology, or GPT, we're calling a hex core, and the next we're seeing it weaponized and turned against the people tasked with creating or investing in it. It feels far-reaching. Like, certainly getting from A to B is harder in reality than it would be for Runeterra, but it's not, and maybe that's the part I found most frustrating about this series. Media has this habit today of building up shows on the premise of ripping your heart out after there's enough emotional investment. Fortiche is really good at this. It's a crescendo that ends with a lump high in your throat as you wonder if you've seen this story somewhere else before. The start of this season wasn't really all that explosive. In fact, it's all about looking back. Because Arcane is built off of that traditional structure of plays, the first 3 episodes of Season 2 begin by recapping the events of Season 1. Not through the Dragon Ball Z-esque narration that we all grew up getting used to, but by showing us the consequences of the first season. It means that GPTs, or those general-purpose technologies known as Hextech and Chemtech, have all the public spotlight on them. As statues are raised and bodies are lowered, you'd almost be forgiven for chalking this up to someone's legacy being cut short and leaving it at that. But what both sides have done here is more complicated than grief, and in a way it's more complicated than legacy. There's this great discussion between Yuval Harari and Steven Pinker. Long before ChatGPT was the sensation it is now, these guys were hashing out philosophy behind emerging technology and the societal impacts it'd have. The biggest thing I took away from this discussion was a bit about social norms.
The crucial line in the sand is the moment when the system knows you better than you know yourself.
How there's kind of this line in the sand, and every day on a small and large scale, people are attempting to move where that line is. Once the line has been picked up, it's always easier to put it back down where it is than to move it somewhere else. And once you've managed to move that norm, they become even more difficult to walk back to where they were originally. So when Mbessa says that weapons can't be unmade, that they'll always be used for war, this is what she's talking about. The moment Jace, Vi, and Jinx decided to use Hextech as a weapon, they moved that line in the sand and rewrote the social norms. It's exactly the sort of thing that Heimerdinger spent the first season being so weary of. Before emerging technology has the ability to become world-ending technology, it has to hit the critical moment of becoming life-ending technology. Arcane has ensured this is cemented by the end of Season 1. Hextech on its own has taken the life of Sky, but in that ambiguity comes more questions. Is the technology responsible, or is the person? When Jace accidentally unalives Rennie's kid, was the tech responsible, or was Jace? When Jinx decides to unleash a whole lot of pent-up daddy issues on the council building, was it the Hextech gemstone that enabled this, or was it her? I want you to keep in mind this question as we go forward, because for this technology, it's one of the more important philosophical questions out there right now. Is technology good bad, or is it neutral? If you go to an Ivy League tech school, they're going to tell you that technology is none of those things. This is a principle known as Kranzberg's first law. It's also something that I disagree with heavily. Let's take a look at modern LLMs, for instance. Now, it's easy to say that once they're trained on our data, they're not good, bad, or neutral, they're just a reflection of the training data. But that isn't all that goes into modern LLMs. You've also got constitutional training, the part of building an AI where you have to teach it not to encourage users to eat rocks or fire off profanity every other word. Sure, that can be done for safety, but Kranzberg's first flaw isn't about safety, it's about a technology's ability to have intent. Up until the modern generation of artificial intelligence, we've never had to deal with machines having intent behind their decisions before. Especially not personal intent. And I'd like to think that that would mean reasonably that these LLMs are a reflection of the ideals of their developers. The good, the bad, and the neutral. So for me, technology, especially emerging technology, it's no longer got the ability to hide behind philosophy like this. I think Arcane challenges Kranzberg's first law really well through the climax of Season 1 and all throughout Season 2. Jace once saw Hextech as an altruistic, shining light of the future, where emerging technology was the hammer and every problem was a nail. And because of this and his constant waffling in Season 1, the dude honestly thought weaponizing it would somehow fix things. It's the kind of stress that leads to poor decision making. Jinx's choice at the end of Season 1 isn't so different. It's a poor decision made under stress that ripples out far beyond her own legacy. Both Jinx and Jace are no longer just inventors and innovators turning their inventions against the world. They've now restarted that ancient cycle, where new inventions and old technology clash for supremacy with little regard to the legacy those conflicts will leave behind. Speaking of conflicts, one of the things Arcane does exceptionally well is showcase what technology looks like in that fight to be top dog. In the real world, these fights aren't always promised to be as cool as those action-packed fight scenes. If you know what a VHS tape is, then you should know what the results of these conflicts look like on a smaller scale. Ever hear of Betamax? Probably not, but that's a symptom of touching grass. Betamax was the competition to VHS in the video cassette formatting market. Obviously, VHS won out, but even now, the legacy of this system has long since ended. That fight of old world technology scrapping against itself to declare a winner, well, Arcane tackles that too. By making every other character a rudimentary cyborg of some kind where individuals alter themselves to fix any kind of perceived flaw, we see Arcane really bring this idea to life. Smeech and Savika both do this by replacing entire limbs. For Savika, her arm was originally lost in a Hextech explosion, being replaced by old-world steampunk tech, and then being upgraded eventually to the arm Jinx made for her. And as a little bonus, on Savika's face you can even see some scars from her being touched by Hextech. She is someone shaped by all sides of emerging technology, disabled by it initially, and then lovingly rebuilt by it. Meanwhile, you've got Smeech, who is just an absolute twisted mess of old-world tech with metal limbs equipped with blades that act as the perfect defense against the gray. I know this guy uses shimmer, but if you look close, you'll notice this is only ever to smoke. It isn't actually augmented into his limbs. For all intents and purposes, Smeech is just a yordle brain attached to a mechanical body who enjoys his puff bar. And for creatures implied to be immortal, that is just fascinating. Did he lose his limbs in combat, or to disease, or maybe he decided that he was just tired of being short? By keeping the origins a bit more ambiguous behind his augmentations, the audience is left to fill in some gaps and reflect on what might lead them to do something similar. In a consequence-free environment, would you replace your legs so you could be taller, or get a bionic limb because it's a new fashion trend? We don't know, and that feels like half the point. Arcane does a great job of show, don't tell, and by keeping some of those pieces of the puzzle out of frame, we're able to ask some critical questions in this threat modeling scenario. Smeech and Savika don't just alter themselves to stay stagnant and content. Augmentation comes with personal development and a choice. For both characters, that choice means they get control back in their lives. They get to decide how their limbs work, function, and what snazzy new stickers can be slapped on them as well. No one is breaking out Hextech gemstones, we're not downing Shimmer to turn into some monstrous hybrid, and because of that, or maybe in spite of it, it's not the most uneven fight. Savika comes out on top, yes, but only by so much. Speaking of a good fight, let's talk about the Enforcers and Caitlyn more specifically doing the exact opposite of that. The weaponization of the Grey is a perfect example of how we move quickly away from anything that could be considered a fair fight. I gotta be honest, Caitlyn's characterization in Season 2 drove me up a wall. I absolutely hated her by the end of it, and that means she's probably a pretty well-written character. The 2010s and 2020s has seen its obsession not just with the Grey villain whose motivation you could understand, but also with the Grey hero whose motivation you could also easily understand. It's more realistic for certain. She's no better than some of her peers, but it is that complexity that makes her character more human and relatable. Caitlyn's fall from grace was exceptional and showed that she was, much like Ambessa, somebody willing to use technology to achieve her goals. Where Ambessa does this for the protection of her legacy and family, Caitlyn does this for the protection of, well, honestly the same thing. And I think that's why I hated Caitlyn so much but loved Ambessa. Ambessa embraced what she was while Kate seemed to fight it at every turn. Caitlyn wanted to be the good guy so bad that it seemed like she lost sight of it when she was becoming the very thing that people feared. Ambessa's role as Caitlyn's mentor shows how willing she was to fall into the same position, and like so many things with Arcane, we're left with a pretty stark real-world parallel to the byproducts of Caitlyn unleashing the Grey on Zaun. 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. This sequence of letters and numbers signify chemicals with vastly different impacts across sectors stemming from the industrialization of agriculture. In an agricultural setting, these chemicals are used as herbicides, and the toxic byproduct, dioxin, typically does not appear in concentrations high enough to cause immediate concerns to farmers. However, when these herbicides were adopted by the military, the story changed.
What do you get when you mix 2,4,5-T acid and 2,4-D acid? You get a powerful herbicide that the United States military used during the Vietnam War, and one that's been tied to serious health problems for the people exposed to it. The answer is Agent Orange.
The shift from agricultural use to military weaponization underscores a darker side of industrial byproducts, where once they were overlooked, they were later harnessed for their destructive potential. In Arcane, we see the Enforcers of Piltover under Caitlyn weaponize the Grey as a way to flush out different parts of Zaun. This is a chemical byproduct of industrialization turned against the people the moment it became convenient and deemed necessary to do so. It's comforting to know that if I wasn't on a watch list before, I most certainly am now. So in both cases, it's an unsettling look at the unintended use behind discoveries that are made with the intent to increase the quality of human life. It's also a reminder of how we don't get to pick our legacy. For me, this is what Caitlyn left the world with, poisoning the people she saw under her, and a willingness to put children in harm's way, all while desperately wanting to be the hero. And even though I hate it, Ambessa is right. Weapons can't be unmade. Her arc with Caitlyn demonstrates how desperation for power will leave some leaders seeking the darkest corners of technology if it means finding an advantage. That kind of desperation is enough to leave some people willing to throw bodies at the wall until their legacy has been established. For Ambessa, it means when Jace and Victor aren't able to work on Hextech for her, she simply throws people at the problem, hoping that with enough brainpower or enough lives, she'll eventually break through that Piltover motto. Try until you get it right. In this instance, she is the personification of the warfighter. The moment emerging technology is noticed, the priority becomes acquisition by any means possible. Sometimes that acquisition can happen monetarily, sometimes it can happen by force, and in other cases, government throws its hands up and says, fuck it, I'll do it myself, I guess, which is just a fancy way of saying they'll contract someone else to do it if they don't have the talent in-house. Mbessa is all but consumed by a need to make Hextech technology work for her. She's seen firsthand what it can do against those unprepared to encounter it. And it's that kind of tactical forethought that allows her to escape her next encounter with emerging technology. Warwick's fight against Jinx, the Enforcers, and Mbessa's forces shows off a beautiful clash of new and old world technology. There is an attempt here by Mbessa to subdue the Shimmer-enhanced Vander through force and pure numbers, but hardened Noxian steel and experience clash with a single shell of a man, and it takes a number of soldiers to simply walk away surviving. It is the closest to a win anyone will be getting from that fight. Once Warwick makes it to the prison, he's easily tearing apart enforcers left and right. Even as Savika and Jinx stare him down, there is a split-second decision the two have to make. Savika, lacking her augmentation, stands no chance in this fight, but Jinx, with her permanent shimmer enhancements, likely has the best shot out of anyone in the room. Or at least she'd be able to buy Savika more time, and for our big fat hero, that's the goal, something underlined by Jinx opting for the grenade before Vander breaks through the psyche of the beast that is Warwick. This is a transformational moment on the battlefield. Piltover and Noxus can now see firsthand how brute force through numbers isn't enough to cut it against emerging technology, and those who attempt to face it on regardless find themselves entering little more than a glorified meat grinder. On the 1st of March 1945, the Polish cavalry overran German defensive positions and forced them to retreat from a village. It would stand as the last mounted charge by the Polish army to this day, largely due to modern aircraft and tanks taking over the war machine. This is a legacy that even now we're only starting to see shift as drone warfare seeks to outpace tanks in terms of use cases and numbers. This all brings us to a pretty critical point. Season 2 introduces to us where technology is going, not just how it came to be or how we see it right now. From here on out, we're exploring some cutting-edge science before eventually falling out into philosophy, where the comparisons grow pretty thin. In the first part of this series, we talked about a famous Arthur Clarke quote about how sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and future emerging technology is going to feel a lot like that. If you remember the hype around ChatGPT when it first came out, it was exactly that feeling. The wonder, mystery, and the potential fit what it means to be awe-inspiring. Jace feels this too initially as Victor finds himself revivified by the Hex Core. Modern technology has essentially remade him. At first, the man behind the eventual machine will try anything. He even turns to his former mentor Singed in hopes that some advanced form of Shimmer can offer a bit of hope. But the effects aren't permanent, unlike some strains of Shimmer, and in Jace's desperation to save him, he makes the choice for Victor. And in reality, that choice is against Victor's wishes at the time. Even Jace has a bit of a rough time with this, as he's been wavering on the idea of Hextech as a technology for a while, but Victor's entanglement with death spurred Jace on to ignore the wishes of his friend and also his own rational thoughts. Let's be real, the Jace that was excited at Victor's subscription to life being reinstated is the same Jace that eventually decides to bring the hammer down onto Salo. For both Vander and Victor at this point in the series, they are revivified beings brought back from the brink thanks to science a la Frankenstein's monster, and both come with the question of, are they really themselves anymore? While Vander's characterization as Warwick tackles this head-on, having the less human aesthetics taking over and showing the beast that's merged with the man, our questioning of Victor and if he's still him, well, that's a little more subtle. I think the biggest hint for me was this interaction Jace ends up having with Victor as he's exploring his emerging powers. That exploration brings Victor straight to his Hextech allegory Jesus moment not so long after Jace has his own. There's this moment where Jace says he never asked for this, that he never wanted to have so many people looking to him for salvation. He's distraught, and it honestly reminds me of a scene out of Dogma of all movies. It's a call to how deeply unfair legacy can feel, especially when the world now sees or needs something from us that we don't feel prepared to handle. Victor explores his existential crisis by trying to be great and to fix all the things that are so obviously wrong with the world. Shimmer Addict? He can fix that. Bad eyesight? He'll cure that too. Disability causing you excruciating pain that modern medicine can't solve? I suppose we could also do something about that. And just like that, the Church of the Glorious Evolved is born. Victor's method of healing allows him to connect to each individual, kind of like casually letting someone else take control of your mouse and keyboard while you just sit and watch the screen. This connection is used to allow Victor to do more outreach and even manage more things outside of his community like the Hex Gates. Through all of this, Jace has been going through a lot. He's essentially suffering the same existential crisis that many great inventors do as they realize the legacy their inventions leave for future generations. It's a heavy burden to bear, and one Jace wishes to correct immediately after his interactions with Victor through Salo. Here's the thing, I think Jace catches onto the same thing the viewers did during this interaction right away. Jace's breath in this frigid environment appears foggy, nothing out of the ordinary. But Salo, well, dude isn't breathing at all. He either doesn't have a need for it anymore, or maybe he isn't even alive. We're left to wonder about all of that, but Jace acts immediately on it well before we're given the time to even process what's happening. In an instant, Salo is gone, succumbing to the inevitable human experience we all do. Death is something we all have to grapple with, just usually not at the end of a hammer. Well before the dawn of the scientific era, we've been trying to extend our lifespan to keep from meeting that inevitable fate we all share. Modern technology is doing its best, with ideals about how if we can just keep the average life expectancy growing at a rate of 1 year every year, and eventually eliminate all diseases with the promise of the latest technology, we'll eventually achieve that infinite lifespan. CRISPR is probably the easiest comparison we can make here. For those not in the know, CRISPR is a gene editing tool because we've laid the foundation for it in the 90s by mapping different DNA sequences, and now we've moved on to the ability to edit them. For some people, this is an absolute nightmare, making comparison to designer babies, eugenics, and other troubling social implications. But for some, CRISPR will be a miracle worker, and one we've already seen in use in China on a set of twins. These two would have experienced a massive number of complications from being born with HIV. That was the legacy their parents would have left for them, but their father saw another option. Through CRISPR, he was able to cure his children and improve their quality of life drastically, and then immediately go to jail. Now their father says he implemented this technology too quickly. At least that's the word from a somewhat recent news article. And being transparent here, I kind of think that's a wretched thing to say. Spend 4 years in jail run by a totalitarian government and come out the other side saying, yeah, maybe my kids should be dead or suffering. When people say that this series feels like a subtle critique on the CCP, I see it in things like this. Singed and Vander would never. Anyways, CRISPR isn't the only way we've been manipulating lifespans with transhumanism. For a while now, we've been trying to simply buy ourselves the time until technology advances far enough to have a cure for any and everything. You all probably know this technology as cryopreservation, though plastinization is an older but less common practice with the same goal in mind. Cryopreservation is the idea of preserving a body for an indefinite period of time until technology allows us to both deal with the complications of preservation, but also until a time where the technology can cure the given ailments that might have led someone to that position in the first place. For a lot of people, cryo is seen as a junk science, one closed off to those with enough cash to prop up the ever-expanding expense that indefinite preservation would require. My views on it are a little bit different though, probably because I've had the chance to work with these organizations when I was doing a private investigation on some cybercrime that had recently been draining the people running these groups of funds. Because as it turns out, a lot of these places are run by volunteers, doctors, scientists, and enthusiasts looking to help folks through some of the hardest parts of the grieving process. I saw this industry employed as a charity service, where some patients left their wealth to make the service affordable for others. Working in the cryo field showed me a new appreciation, not necessarily for the technology, but for the compassion within the technology. For some people, the thought of a loved one rotting away in the ground is horrific. I talked to one man who said the idea of worms eating away at the eyeballs of a loved one was all he could think about since they'd grown sick. Cryo was his and his children's greatest comfort. It's a vision that makes it all too easy to understand why people might turn towards the path of preservation or transhumanism in general to combat failing life expectancy. You probably guessed that this is where Vander steps into the picture. The question of preservation and the pursuit for a cure to death has haunted corners of humanity forever. I see Vander as an unwilling participant. He had hung up the proverbial and literal gloves, seeing firsthand the result of cyclical violence. Vander saw promise in breaking the cycle, and though the execution of that vision was different compared to Civica and Silco, he wanted it all the same. Shimmer and that augmentation of self was only ever a means to an end to protect his family. It shows an unwillingness to engage in this alteration of self, something that's backed up more by him being a bartender. It's not exactly a job you're encouraged to drink at. It puts him in a position of responsibility. Like he tells Vi, he's responsible for the people following him, and having the clearest mind possible genuinely helps. Vander's fall and subsequent revival as Warwick stand in contrast to his wishes, but probably not the wishes of his family, although the methodology leaves a lot to be desired here. Neither Vi nor Jinx grapple in depth with the question of Vander's humanity as the beast that is Warwick is entangled into his psyche. Instead, it's a reunion, a heartfelt one too. The beast within is just another battle in an ongoing war. Even when Vander meets his supposed end at the height of Season 2, it's all about getting Dad back, not wondering if Vander is really Vander anymore. And going even further on this line of questioning, it's clear that Vander getting just an extra moment to spend with his family is precious, but did he want this? Would the man inside the beast feel it as an affront to his humanity, or would he have fought tooth and claw to get them back in his arms? There's not an easy answer here. With hindsight being 20/20 and all that jazz, the question of can we is becoming far less important compared with should we. Before I forget, this is probably the perfect time to bring up Oriana, Dr. Ravek's daughter, and the primary motivator behind the production of Shimmer and Chemtech in general. She's got one of those untold stories that will make us question what it means for emerging technology to provide the cure for death, just like it did for Skye, Victor, and Vander. Dr. Ravek's research is important here, though. For his daughter, nothing short of perfection will do. This is a man with the patience to search 20 years for the 99% solution versus taking the 80% solution in just a day. That precision, dedication, and patience drive a man who would commit countless medical atrocities if it meant bringing her back. When Singe makes the offer to speak to his former pupil Victor on behalf of Ambessa, I firmly believe this is with the motivation of discovering more about how Hextech augmented Victor. The care he has for his daughter means the drawbacks that Vander suffers would never do, and the humanity he sees Victor as having lost isn't an option either. Oriana has to be herself, in whole, because this is the legacy that Singed alone wants to leave. That means that this has to happen within his lifetime, so simply moving the technology up isn't good enough. The end result has to be something usable. This obviously stands in pretty stark contrast to Heimerdinger's ideas, where Singe prides himself on the patience and accuracy. It's still something to be done now, within the current lifespan. Heimerdinger defies this by saying that patience and progress can be tied to multiple generations, not a single lifetime. Ultimately, this followed over safety measures and emerging tech is what leads to these two parting ways. They stand to ask the important question of the speed of progress and exemplify all too well why some timelines simply aren't optional for some innovators. Even knowing the fallout, all the moral consequences, and all the pain that comes from the Piltover model of trying until it's done right, it could still be worth it if it meant saving someone else. At least for Dr. Revek it would be. And none of that comes with asking how Oriana would feel about this or her father's atrocities all being done in her name. This is the real reason why I think we get the quote that says, "Love and legacy are the sacrifices we make for progress." Episode 6 of Season 2 brings home the sacrifice part of progress. The fights here are wicked. Vander and Rictus, Jace and Victor, and everyone versus Warwick. This episode explores what it looks like when emerging technology begins to clash with itself. We're far off from the days of Savika and Smeech scrapping it out in a back alley. Instead, we're seeing the fallout from emerging technology in real time. It isn't just that Hextech makes for a powerful explosion, but it's also being used to hold back the capabilities of other new forms of technology like Shimmer. And when that technology goes offline temporarily because Jace decides to open fire on his friend, well, all hell breaks loose. Vander essentially dies yet again to become Warwick, losing what sense of self he had, all to become a tool of violence once again. As it turns out, when it comes to emerging technology, security measures can be pretty fucking important, especially around children. We don't live in a fantasy realm, and if Arcane wanted to shake us down and remind us of that, well, mission accomplished with Isha. Children aren't divorced from emerging technology, and sometimes they're the first ones to experience the fallout. Emerging technology destroys barriers to entry, and not always for the good. In 2023 and 2024, we saw a heavy spike in cybercrime globally, but we also saw a rise in child terrorism. The commonality between the two is easy access to emerging tech, making these things easier to achieve, and a willingness for minors to act in extremist events. I'm not going to get into this one much. It's easy to sensationalize this kind of thing, and it's not really what I want to focus on here. Instead, let's talk about the untold story. Isha is a character that doesn't just lack a voice, but she lacks a complete story. We get glimpses, but very few concrete answers. Arcane is full of untold stories, not just for time and pacing purposes, but also because that's just how real life is. I think the thing that Isha does best here is answer the question of identity and how we initially see someone. When we first see Isha, she's not really presented as her own character. Instead, her brown hair, goggles, and mining hat allow us to immediately identify aspects of Milo and Clagger in her. And just like when meeting people in the real world, sometimes the way we identify them initially is by who they remind us of, what traits they share in common, and how that might inform us of our like or dislike for that person. It takes time for people to become unique in our mind, and by the end of Isha's story, we don't see pieces of Jinx's childhood, we see a young girl willing to risk it all for the family she's finally found. This is also how we sometimes get idealized images of people, and it can be a lot more pronounced for individuals who have passed on. It's considered bad manners to speak ill of the dead, but if we're never realistic about who someone was, their legacy becomes that of a myth. The question of identity or how we're seen by others, it's not exclusive to Isha. Skye is like a lot of side characters. Her story is also untold, but it lends to a greater impact because it stays untold. Skye is consumed by this new technology literally, her corporeal form disintegrating in a selfless act to try and save Victor from the same fate. She's a character whose biggest trait up until this point has been her unrequited affection for Victor. But through the series and her time within Victor's psyche, we see the reality of what it might mean to be resurrected through new technology, at least the way it is now. Keen observers might notice that Sky's hair is never the same in any shot she's seen in, a sign that even Victor has hazy memories of how she would appear, its personal details of her life never shining through outside of that one brief moment before she was consumed. As the viewer, we're able to recognize that Victor is an unreliable narrator in this moment. It gives us time to stop and ask if we would want to be revived in this manner if it meant someone getting it wrong. While serving as a spiritual guide for Victor, Sky is essentially a sounding board within an arcane echo chamber. From the outside looking in, she reads as an idealized perception of herself, something Victor is projecting as the best version of her. And the reason is simple, that's the one he wants guiding him. The end of her arc reveals that it's unlikely Victor will miss these talks at all, leaving us to question if the man has just been talking to himself the entire time. And you know what? That's something pretty hypocritical for the Machine Herald. Jace did an absolutely awful job of crediting Victor when he deserved it. It was their Hextech dream after all, and in the same vein, it feels like Victor has done the same thing with Sky. She is a shade of herself that contributes to the project deeply, but never receives the outward recognition of their shared development. It's a sombering moment that reminds us of the biggest concept behind this series. What will the legacy of Jace and Victor be after this? What will Sky's be? Will anyone even remember her, or will she be a footnote in the mind of a man turning his back on humanity? Legacy, death, and second chances. The Machine Herald embodies them all by the end of episode 8 after seeing himself destroyed and rebuilt countless times. First by disease, then by technology, and even at his own hands. Victor doesn't just magically wake up and decide that life should be void of errors. He has tried to be a better version of himself at every turn. It's something that didn't yield enough results until you see him basically snap. He tries to reason with Jace that this was their dream all along. But as Victor calls for the glorious evolution to begin, Jace, ever defiant, says that Victor died in that room. The room he's speaking of is the council chamber, and the death he's speaking about is the climax of season 1. If we know Victor to be an unreliable narrator for Sky, this line alone calls into question if he is even Victor, or if what we're actually seeing is the Hexcore attempting to replicate Victor. Maybe that's why we see his thoughts towards Hextech and emerging technology shift every time he's rebuilt in some way. We know this as poor imitation, or the Xerox effect. It's a phenomenon by which we take an image, put it on a copy machine, and then receive a slightly different but copied image every time. This copy of a copy effect basically implies that while things may not get worse with each copy, they are rarely the same. And this is what we're seeing out of Victor's evolution. His moral compass, the ideas that guide his base actions, have shifted because he fundamentally isn't Victor. He is a copy of Victor, with all the flaws of man and machine. Those flaws ultimately land the world of Runeterra staring down a future where humanity is a whisper the cosmos couldn't be bothered to remember. It's a future where perfection of anything means the absence of everything. With the background hum of existential questions of how to avoid that future, the climax kicks off. Victor, having become the great Machine Herald with his evolved followers, begins trying to convert others into the fold. It is no longer a question of consent or autonomy. The team-up we see of Ekko, Jinx, the Enforcers, and even Noxians brings with it a grim reminder. A surefire way to bring opposition together is to give them a common enemy, and emerging technology hurtling towards world-ending capabilities will do just that. It is a lot easier to fight amongst each other when there's no world-ending threat on the horizon, you know? At this point, we've moved from old world technology fighting against itself to emerging technology fighting against those without access to emerging technology getting into an arms race with itself to become the dominant force. We only see an end to that through, quite frankly, the feel-good bromance of Jace and Victor, where the human elements manage to overcome the machine, and eventually we find the value in improvement instead of perfection. And really, I'm left wondering by the end of Season 2 if it had to be this way, if there couldn't have been some alternative path that we could have walked where these bumps in the road were a little bit more manageable by just a bit of forethought and hindsight. Ekko provides the answer to those heavy notes Arcane would have us end on. His journey introduces an exploration of time travel and alternative realities, embodying the idea of second chances to reshape outcomes. His encounter with Powder in the alternative universe offers a portrayal of hope and redemption. In this realm, she's reaching all the potential that Ekko has seen in Jinx, untouched by the cycle continuing on with her. This encounter is transformative, not only for Ekko, but also for the narrative itself, illustrating the possibilities embedded within alternate realities and their impact on personal redemption. And none of that could be more important than when Ekko returns to the original timeline and encounters Jinx as she's about to pull the plug on the cycle in the most radical way possible, opting out with a monkey bomb. Ekko's repeated engagement of the time drive becomes an embodiment of second chances and Piltover's model, but maybe where we see it at its absolute best. We try until we get it right. Emerging technology allows Ekko to do just that. In his hands, the hands of a character who represent the hopeful outlook of technology and community, he is able to right the wrongs of the moment. Not without consequence, though. Using the time drive is exhausting and has a limit on how far back the hands of time can be turned. It's no different than a second chance on a personal and societal level. We can make amends, but there's only so much damage that we can repair. It's not like Ekko can erase the trauma of Jinx, and for that matter, he couldn't do that for Powder either, but the ability for him to try until he gets it right, with or without the time drive, that does wonders to clear the way so others can heal. Piltover's motto may just be as much of a driving force behind Arcane as Legacy is. Perhaps that motto is all Legacy really is, trying until it's done right. Arcane asks us through its narrative to explore that oldest and most fundamental question we all ask ourselves as we become more aware of the depth the world has to offer. What is the purpose of it all? Is there any purpose? Existential philosophical questions like this haven't gone anywhere, and much of the rhetoric around it in the early and mid-1900s holds up incredibly well today. This is the era that helped popularize the idea that life is essentially meaningless, but because of that, it can mean anything we want it to be, and maybe that's all Legacy is, the ability to give our lives meaning behind anything we do. If the concept of Legacy was so simple, this video probably could have been 10 minutes long, but if you're still listening, you know the idea is so much more complex than that, because we can't always dictate the legacy we leave, even though that would be awfully fucking nice. That fact can make genuine attempts to move the line we talked about at the start of this very difficult. It means that second chances can go unnoticed, or the sacrifices made don't amount to anything. Second chances and Heimerdinger like to vibe like PB&J. The failed mentor that couldn't properly raise a hero in Jace or Victor saw a different way forward with Ekko. Through Season 1, Heimerdinger's pushed back against progress, and in a way that only spurred on the further use of Hextech. He went from someone who saw progress as something that can be mapped over the span of humanity, while forgetting that we often gauge progress by what can be done in a single lifetime. His work in the alternate universe shows a man who understands that and has realigned his work and perspective with the new knowledge he's been presented with, which is the mark of a good scientist and a mentor finding redemption. In the final moments we see him, Heimerdinger's sacrifice to ensure Ekko makes it back to the original timeline embodies what progress really means. It is good people planting seeds, knowing that they will never sit in the shade of those trees, and as a viewer, this is the legacy Heimerdinger leaves us with. He is the old guard handing over the keys to a newer generation. It is interesting to note here that in the alternative timeline, Hextech never came into existence. Maybe the explosion that took Vi's life also took Jace's since he was on the other side of the door, meaning he and Victor would never bring Hextech to the world. And you know, no matter what happened to prevent Hextech from becoming popular, none of that would have stopped Dr. Ravek from developing Shimmer, because there would still be the pursuit for transhumanism with Oriana's death and his attempts to overcome it. Those attempts outlive Heimerdinger's storyline. Emerging technology is a constant, no matter the flavor it comes in, so we're left with two possibilities. 1. Heimerdinger reconciles with Dr. Revek over the pace of progress, or 2. Heimerdinger is able to shift the focus of others on the council to fixing the problems we have in the present, and that is what helps stave off the shimmer epidemic and bridge some of the divide we see between Zahn and Piltover. In either case, Heimerdinger is a proactive part of the community and their future here, not ignoring emerging technology, but finding ways to help it coexist with the world around it. The intertwining of old and emerging technologies not only propels the narrative of Arcane, but it also mirrors our own societal journey. The integration of these technologies, as seen through Ekko and Heimerdinger's arcs, represents a metaphorical second chance, a chance to reconcile the past with the present and to shape it into a more hopeful future. That second chance isn't painless. It takes time, effort, and can only do so much, but there is benefit in making that effort. Within a single generation, we've seen so many general-purpose technologies come to fruition, and we've seen how some of the same problems get repeated in them. The rise of television, the internet, social media, and now AI brings about a number of parallel issues. This is a chance to learn from past societal failures. As we stand at the edge of technological advancement in our own world, the lessons from Arcane serve as a reminder of the complexities inherent in balancing innovation with legacy. The series highlights the importance of preservation and adaptability, urging us to try until we get it right, an adage that speaks to the heart of progress. However, progress is not devoid of cost. The pursuit of innovation must be tempered with an awareness of its broader implications. Heimerdinger's eventual willingness to embrace change and Ekko's determination to harness new technologies for healing exemplify the potential of merging past wisdom with future possibilities. Yet, they also underscore the need for careful stewardship of our advancements to ensure they contribute positively to society. In the end, Arcane challenges us to contemplate our own roles within this dynamic interplay of technology and legacy. It prompts us to ask ourselves, what seeds are we planting today, and how will they grow in the shadows of tomorrow's world? As emerging technologies continue to integrate with established systems, our task is to balance innovation with a mindful respect for the legacy it creates, a delicate dance that defines the true price of progress. Well, that's all from me today. Thanks for joining me on this adventure through media analysis and philosophy regarding emerging technology. I'm still debating if videos like this belong on a different channel, but it was wildly fun to do so, and I've already got a list together of some other favorite titles I'll probably be inspecting this year. For the next video though, it's definitely time to get back on track to some news and educational stuff about artificial intelligence. There's been a lot going on that side of things, but thanks to the new and fantastic editor I've got onboarded, it should be a lot easier for me to manage bringing high quality videos to you a few different times a month. If you've somehow made it this far, let me leave you with a couple of my favorite Easter eggs from Arcane. In Season 1, Episode 6, Kate is giving Shimmer to Vi, and as she's coming to, Vi sees Felicia. For just a minute, she sees her mom again, and I really like that. That one made me smile. Second one, because Isha doesn't speak, she never haunts Jinx. Alright, are you ready for the biggest Easter egg out of Arcane? Hear me out. It's just Final Fantasy.